Sometimes the mistakes we made as children follow us home years later, demanding we finally face what we've been running from. In a quiet corner of town, three boys once threw rocks at an old Virgin Mary statue, thinking it was just harmless. Fun. But minutes later, Mark collapsed. Blood poured from his nose as he dropped to his knees. His friends watched in horror as the bleeding stopped just as suddenly as it started. That moment changed all their lives. Now, 8 years later, James is back in his hometown. He quit his job and doesn't know what comes next. Walking past the old statue, he sees fresh flowers at its base. Someone still cares for her. The memory hits him like a wave, and for the first time in years he feels peace. As he meets up with his old friends, one question won't leave him alone. Was that day about punishment, or was something greater trying to reach them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The corporate badge clattered into the trash can with a hollow plastic sound that seemed to echo James's entire adult life. 28 years old, and he was throwing away his identity card like it meant nothing, which, he supposed, it didn't anymore. His parents' house looked smaller than he remembered, the blue paint faded and peeling around the window frames. The maple tree in the front yard had grown taller, its branches now scraping against the roof during windstorms. Everything felt simultaneously familiar and foreign, like looking at a photograph of a place you used to know well. "James, honey, are you sure about this?" His mother's voice carried the particular brand of worry that only mothers could perfect. Margaret Walsh had been perfecting it for 53 years, first on her own children, then on every neighborhood kid who wandered. Through her kitchen, quitting your job without having another one lined up? "I'm sure, Mom." James dropped his suitcase by the stairs, the same stairs where he'd sat countless mornings tying his shoes before school. "I couldn't stay there another day. I was dying." A little more each morning I walked into that building. His father looked up from his newspaper, reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. Robert Walsh had aged in the 8 years since James moved to the city. More grey at his temples, deeper lines around his eyes, but the same steady presence that had anchored their family through every storm. "Son, everybody feels that way about work sometimes. That's why they call it work and not vacation. This was different, Dad." James slumped into the kitchen chair that had been his designated spot since childhood. The vinyl squeaked under his weight, another sound that transported him backward in time. I was writing reports about market penetration strategies for products I didn't believe in, selling to people who didn't need them. I'd sit in meetings talking about optimizing consumer engagement metrics and think about how we were basically trying to manipulate people into buying things they couldn't afford. Margaret set a mug of coffee in front of him, prepared exactly the way he liked it. Cream, no sugar. Some things never changed, and he was grateful for that small constant in a world that seemed to shift beneath his feet every day. "What happened to the boy who wanted to help people?" she asked gently. "You used to talk about becoming a teacher or maybe a social worker. You wanted to make a difference." James stared into his coffee, watching the cream swirl into patterns that reminded him of clouds. "I guess I thought making money was the same thing as making a difference. Turns out it's not." The morning sun slanted through the kitchen window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. This kitchen had been the center of so many conversations: homework help, relationship advice, career guidance. His parents had always been there with patient ears and gentle wisdom, even when he'd stopped asking for it. "Well?" Robert folded his newspaper with decisive crispness. "You're home now. That's what matters. Take some time to figure things out. The guest room is yours as long as you need it." After breakfast, James walked downtown, needing to reacquaint himself with the rhythms of his childhood home. The town of Millbrook had changed in subtle ways during his absence. The old Woolworths had become a craft store. The movie theater now showed only one film at a time instead of 3. But the bones of the place remained the same. Tree-lined streets, front porches with rocking chairs, the kind of community where people still waved at strangers. He found himself at Murphy's Diner, a place that had been serving coffee and comfort food since 1952. The red vinyl booths were the same ones he'd sat in as a teenager, probably patched and repatched a dozen times, but still holding their shape. The smell of bacon grease and fresh coffee created an instant portal to 1,000 Saturday mornings. Well, I'll be damned. Jimmy Walsh as I live and breathe. James turned to see Rita Murphy, the owner's daughter, now running the place herself. She'd been 2 years ahead of him in school, captain of the volleyball team, and one of the few people who'd always been kind to everyone regardless of their social status. "Rita, good to see you." He meant it. There was something comforting about being recognized, about slipping back into the identity of Jimmy Walsh instead of James Walsh, regional sales manager. "Heard you were back in town. Your mom's been bragging about your big city job for years. What brings you home?" "Just needed a change of scenery," he said, not ready to explain the complete collapse of his professional ambitions to someone he'd known since middle school. "Well, sit anywhere you like. Coffee's fresh." He chose a booth by the window where he could watch the town wake up. An elderly man walked his small dog past the pharmacy. 2 women chatted on the steps of the library. A postal worker made his rounds, stopping to pet every cat that crossed his path. There was a gentleness to it all that he'd forgotten existed. "You know Mrs. Chen, don't you?" Rita appeared with a coffee pot, nodding toward an elderly Asian woman sitting alone at the counter. "She's been asking about you and your friends. Said she remembered you boys from when you were kids." Mrs. Chen turned at the sound of her name, her face brightening with recognition. She must have been in her 70s now, but her eyes were sharp and kind. James remembered her from the corner grocery store her family had run for decades. "Jimmy Walsh," she said, making her way over to his booth with careful but determined steps. "I wondered when you'd come home." "Mrs. Chen, how are you?" "Old but grateful for each day," she said, settling into the seat across from him. "I've been thinking about you boys lately. You and Mark and Tommy, such good children, even when you were being mischievous." Something in her tone made James look up from his coffee. There was a knowing quality to her voice, as if she was talking about more than just typical childhood pranks. "We had our moments," he admitted. "Yes, you did, especially that summer before you all went off to different colleges. There was something troubling you boys. I could see it in your faces when you'd come into the store." James felt his stomach. A tighten. Mrs. Chen had always been observant, but he'd never realized how much she'd noticed about their final summer together. "You know about the old statue, don't you?" she continued, her voice gentle but direct. "The one behind the Martinelli lot." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "That statue has a story, Jimmy. A sad story and a beautiful one. I've lived in this town for 46 years, and I've seen what that place means to people. I've also seen what happens when it's not treated with respect. Mrs. Chen, I'm not scolding you, dear boy. I'm just saying that some places hold more than we can see, and sometimes when we're young and don't understand the weight of things, we stumble into something bigger than ourselves." She reached across the table and patted his hand, with fingers that were soft and warm, despite their age. "I've been putting flowers there every few weeks for the past 8 years, but lately someone else has been doing it too. Fresh flowers, beautiful arrangements, someone who understands." James felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of a knot he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten it was there. "Who?" he asked. "I don't know for certain, but I have my suspicions." Mrs. Chen's eyes twinkled with gentle mischief. "Why don't you take a walk over there this evening? Sometimes the answers we need are waiting in the places we're afraid to go." After she left, James sat in the diner for another hour, watching the town move through its daily rhythms. Children walked to school with backpacks bouncing. Shop owners unlocked their doors and flipped their signs to "open." Life continued with The same steady persistence it had always shown, indifferent to his personal crisis, but somehow comforting in its reliability. When he finally left the diner, he walked aimlessly through streets that held the ghosts of his younger self. The elementary school where he'd learned to read, the park where he'd played baseball every summer, the library where he'd discovered his love of books about faraway places. But all roads seemed to lead back to the same destination, the Overgrown. Lot behind what used to be Martinelli's Hardware, the lot that held a weathered statue and 8 years' worth of unresolved guilt. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, James found himself walking toward that forgotten corner of town. His feet knew the way, even though his mind wanted to resist. Some conversations couldn't be avoided forever, and he was beginning to understand that he'd come home not just to escape his old life, but to finally face the moment that had defined everything that came after. The statue stood where it always had, beneath the spreading branches of an oak tree that had grown larger and more protective over the years. But Mrs. Chen was right. There were fresh flowers at its base. White roses and baby's breath, arranged with care and intention. For the first time in 8 years, James Walsh stood before the Virgin Mary statue and felt something other than shame. He felt the possibility of peace, distant but real, like a light glimpsing through a window at the end of a long, dark road. James returned to the statue at dawn, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't name or resist. The morning mist clung to the grass, making the weathered stone figure appear to emerge from a dream. In the pale light, she looked both ancient and timeless. Her carved features worn smooth by decades of weather, but still holding an expression of infinite compassion. He'd barely slept, his mind churning through memories he'd spent years trying to bury. But standing here now, he felt ready to face what had happened on that summer evening 8 years ago. It had been the week before they were all supposed to leave for college. James for state, Mark for community college, Tommy for trade school. They were 18 and feeling invincible in the way that only teenagers can, convinced that the world was waiting for them to reshape it according to their grand plans. Mark had been the ringleader that night, as he usually was. Mark Torino, all swagger and nervous energy, the kind of kid who laughed too loud and took every dare because backing down felt like death. His parents fought constantly, bitter, screaming matches that echoed through their thin-walled house and sent Mark looking for escape wherever he could find it. Tommy Castellano was the follower, sweet-natured and loyal to a fault. His family ran the corner pizza place, and Tommy spent every afternoon after school rolling dough and taking orders, saving every penny for the auto mechanics program that would finally let him work with his hands instead of other people's leftovers. And James had been somewhere in the middle, not quite bold enough to lead, not quite smart enough to walk away. The classic middle child, trying to keep everyone happy while never quite fitting anywhere himself. They'd been walking home from the basketball courts that evening, sweaty and tired from 2 hours of pickup games. The summer air was thick with humidity and the promise of thunderstorms, the kind of weather that made everything feel electric and restless. "Bet you guys are too chicken to go mess with the crazy statue lady," Mark had said, his voice carrying that particular edge it got when he was looking for trouble. "What statue lady?" Tommy had asked, bouncing a basketball against his hip. "You know, the Virgin Mary thing behind the old hardware store. My cousin says it's cursed. Says bad things happen to people who disrespect it." James had felt a flutter of unease even then. He'd passed the statue hundreds of times over the years, and there was something about it that had always made him slow his steps. Not fear exactly, but a sense that he was walking past something important, something that deserved more attention than he was giving it. "That's just superstitious garbage," he'd said, though he hadn't felt as confident as he'd sounded. "Oh yeah, then prove it. Let's go throw some rocks at it, show that old statue who's boss." Tommy had looked uncomfortable. "I don't know, man. That seems kind of mean." "Mean to who?" "It's a chunk of stone, Tommy. It doesn't have feelings." James remembered how Mark's eyes had been too bright, his smile too sharp. Even then, he'd sensed that his friend was running from something bigger than boredom, something that required destruction to keep at bay. They'd found the statue as the last light was fading from the sky. It stood in a small clearing surrounded by overgrown weeds and volunteer trees, clearly forgotten by everyone except whoever had been maintaining it. Even in the gathering darkness, James could see that someone cared for this place, the area. Around the statue was clean, free of litter, and there were the remains of old flowers at its base. "See? Harmless," Mark had said, but his voice was strained. He'd picked up a piece of broken brick from the crumbling foundation of the old building and hefted it in his hand. "Just a stupid statue. Mark, maybe we should—" Tommy had started. But Mark was already winding up for his throw. The first brick had struck the statue's base with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet evening air. James had felt it in his chest like a physical blow, as if something sacred had been violated. "Your turn," Mark had said, his breathing quick and shallow. He'd handed James a rock, and before he could think about what he was doing, James had thrown it. The stone had hit the statue's outstretched hand, chipping away a piece of carved stone that had probably taken hours to create. Tommy had been the most reluctant, but peer pressure and loyalty had won out over his better instincts. His rock had barely grazed the statue's robes, but it was enough to make him a participant in what they were doing. "One more each," Mark had said, and there had been something manic in his voice now, something desperate. "Really, let her have." James's second throw had been harder, fueled by a strange anger he couldn't identify. The rock had struck the statue's face, and for a moment, in the uncertain light, it had seemed like the carved features shifted, like the stone face had winced in pain. That was when Mark had thrown his final rock, harder than any of the others. It had hit the statue squarely in the chest, with a sound like a bone breaking. And then Mark had stopped mid-laugh, his face going pale in the twilight. Blood had begun to pour from his nose, not a trickle but a torrent, staining his white t-shirt crimson. He'd staggered backward, his hands flying to his face, and then his knees had buckled. "Jesus, Mark!" Tommy had dropped to his friend's side, trying to help him stem the bleeding with his own shirt, but James had stood frozen, staring at the statue. For just a moment, and he'd never been sure if it was real or just a trick of the fading light. The carved eyes had seemed to look directly at him, not angry, not judgmental, but infinitely sad, as if she was grieving for all of them. The bleeding had stopped as suddenly as it had started. One moment Mark was hemorrhaging all over himself and Tommy, and the next the flow had simply ceased, leaving him pale and shaky but otherwise unharmed. They'd taken him to the emergency room, concocting a story about a basketball injury to explain the nosebleed. The doctors had run tests, taken x-rays, checked his blood pressure and pulse. Everything had come back normal, no explanation for what had happened, but Mark had been different after that night. Quieter, more serious, as if something essential had shifted inside him. They'd all been different, actually, but they'd made a pact never to talk about what had happened at the statue. Some things were too strange, too uncomfortable to examine too closely. Now, standing in the morning mist 8 years later, James could see that the chip in the statue's hand was still there, a small scar that marked their passage through this place. But someone had clearly been caring for her. The area was clean, the weeds trimmed back, and those fresh flowers continued to appear with reliable frequency. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts, until he found Tommy's number. It had been 3 years since they'd spoken, but suddenly James needed to know that his old friends were okay, that they'd somehow survived the guilt and confusion that had followed them all into adulthood. The phone rang twice before Tommy picked up. "James, holy shit, man, I was just thinking about you. Where are you?" "I'm back in town. Tommy, I need to ask you something. Do you ever think about that night, the statue?" There was a long pause, and James could hear construction noise in the background, hammering, the distant rumble of heavy machinery. "Every day," Tommy said finally, his voice quiet despite the noise around him. "James, there's something you need to know. Mark wants to meet with us. He's been asking about it for months. He thinks it's time we went back there together. Mark? Mark Torino? He goes by Father Mark now, can you believe it? He's a pastor at the little church on Elm Street. Been clean for 5 years, got himself ordained 2 years ago. Guy turned his whole life around. James felt the world tilt slightly around him. Mark, the wild child who'd led them into trouble more times than James could count, had become a man of God. He's been leaving flowers, hasn't he? James asked, though he already knew the answer. Yeah, and James, he wants to tell us why. Tommy's construction site sat on the edge of town where the old Miller farm used to be, a sprawling development of modest homes designed for young families just starting out. James found Tommy standing next to a concrete mixer, his hard hat pushed, back on his head, reviewing blueprints with 2 younger men who looked at him with the kind of respect reserved for someone who'd earned his authority through competence rather than inheritance. The transformation was striking. The last time James had seen Tommy Castellano, he'd been a skinny 18-year-old with nervous energy and grease under his fingernails from working on cars. Now, at 26, he'd filled out into someone solid and dependable, his handshake firm and his smile genuine. Can you believe this? Tommy gestured at the half-built houses around them, pride evident in his voice. 6 months ago, this was just an empty field. Now we're building homes for 12 families. Real homes, James? Places where kids will take their first steps and families will eat Sunday dinner together. James looked around at the construction site with new eyes. What he'd initially seen as suburban sprawl suddenly looked like something else entirely. Hope made manifest in lumber and drywall, dreams taking physical shape. You built all this. Well, not alone. Got a crew of 8 guys now, all local. We hire from the community college construction program when we can. Give kids a chance to learn the trade while they're earning money. Tommy's hard hat caught the morning sun as he turned to survey his work. Started the company 3 years ago with a loan from the bank and more determination than sense. They walked through the site together, Tommy pointing out details that revealed his attention to quality over quick profits, extra insulation in the walls, high-efficiency windows, concrete foundations poured deeper than code required because, as Tommy put it, a house should outlast the people who build it. What happened to auto mechanics? James asked, remembering his friend's original plan. Tommy's expression darkened slightly. Did that for 2 years after trade school. Worked for Peterson's garage. You remember old Pete? But then Mark got into some real trouble, and I realized I needed to make better choices about who I was spending time with. They'd found a quiet spot on a stack of lumber where they could talk without being overheard by the construction crew. Tommy pulled 2 bottles of water from a cooler and handed one to James. Mark went through a real bad period after that night at the statue. Started drinking heavy, then moved on to harder stuff. Got arrested twice for fighting, lost 3 jobs in 6 months. It was like watching someone destroy himself in slow motion. James felt a familiar weight settle in his stomach. I should have stayed in touch, should have tried to help. We all should have done a lot of things differently, but you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved, and Mark was determined to burn his life down. Tommy took a long drink of water, his eyes distant with difficult memories. The weird thing was, he kept talking about the statue, said he could feel it calling to him, said he needed to go back and make things right, but every time he got close to that place, something would stop him. Fear, shame, who knows? What changed? Rock bottom, I guess. He overdosed about 6 years ago. Heroin, they think, though he'd mixed it with alcohol and pills. Paramedics brought him back, but it was close. Real close. Tommy's voice was steady, but James could see the pain in his eyes. When he got out of the hospital, he came to see me. Said he'd had some kind of vision while he was dying. Said he saw the statue and she was crying. James felt a chill run down his spine despite the warm morning sun. That's when he got serious about getting clean, checked himself into a program, started going to church, really threw himself into recovery. And James, he's been back to the statue every week for the past 5 years. Sometimes more than once a week. What does he do there? prays mostly, leaves flowers. Sometimes he just sits and talks to her like she's listening, which maybe she is. I don't know anymore what's possible and what isn't. Tommy stood up and walked to the edge of the lumber pile, looking out over the houses his crew was building. You know what the strangest part is? Ever since Mark started visiting that statue regularly, his luck has been different. Good different. He got accepted into seminary on a full scholarship despite having no college degree. The church that hired him was exactly the kind of place he wanted to work. People respond to him in ways that don't make logical sense. Hardened. Criminals breaking down and confessing their sins. Elderly people finding peace they'd been searching for their whole lives. You think it's connected, the statue and Mark's ministry? I think there are more things in heaven and earth than we learned about in high school, you know? I think that night, 8 years ago, we stumbled into something bigger than 3 stupid teenagers throwing rocks. And I think Mark figured out how to ask for forgiveness from whatever we offended. James considered this, remembering the sense of presence he'd felt at the statue both as a teenager and yesterday evening. Have you been back? To the statue, I mean. Tommy nodded. Every month for the past 2 years. Never ran into Mark there. But I've left flowers a few times. Seemed like the right thing to do. He paused, then looked directly at James. I've got a 15-year-old daughter now, did I tell you that? Sarah. She's starting to make the kind of choices that keep me awake at night, staying out late, hanging around with kids who think rules are suggestions. And I keep thinking about how different things might have been if we'd made better choices. That night, you think she knows about what happened? No, and I hope she never has to. But I want her to understand that some things are sacred, that there are lines you don't cross even when nobody's watching. That actions have consequences, even when those consequences don't show up for years. A truck pulled up to the construction site and Tommy waved to the driver. That's the lumber delivery I've been waiting for. But James, Mark wants to meet with both of us tomorrow evening at the statue. He says it's time we learned the whole story about what that place really is and why what happened to us wasn't random. James felt his pulse quicken. What do you mean, the whole story? Mark's been doing research, historical research, church records, that kind of thing. He says there's a reason that statue is there, and a reason we were drawn to it that night. He thinks maybe what happened wasn't punishment, maybe it was an invitation. As James walked back to his car, he found himself thinking about Tommy's transformation from follower to leader, from a kid who went along with whatever Mark suggested, to a man who built homes and employed neighbors and worried about his daughter's future. The Tommy he'd known in high school had been sweet but directionless, always looking to someone else to decide what came next. Now Tommy Castellano was someone who made decisions that affected other people's lives, someone who took responsibility. Seriously, because he'd learned the cost of not taking it seriously enough. Maybe that was what growing up really meant. Not just getting older, but finally understanding that your choices rippled outward in ways you might not see for years. The small church on Elm Street had been built in 1967. A modest brick building with a simple cross and a sign that read, All Souls Community Church. Everyone welcome. James sat in the back pew during the evening service, watching Mark Torino, father. Mark, lead a congregation of about 30 people in prayer. The transformation was even more dramatic than Tommy's. The Mark that James remembered had been all sharp edges and restless energy, someone who couldn't sit still for 5 minutes without bouncing his leg or cracking his knuckles. This man moved with quiet confidence, his voice steady and warm, as he spoke about forgiveness and second chances. Mark's sermon was built around the parable of the prodigal son, but he told it in a way that made it feel immediate and personal rather than abstract and distant. He talked about coming home after making terrible mistakes, about the fear that you've damaged something beyond repair, about the grace that waits for us even when we can't forgive ourselves. Sometimes, Mark said, his eyes scanning the small, in congregation, we think we've wandered so far from home that we can't find our way back. We think we've broken something that can't be fixed, disappointed someone who can't be satisfied. But grace doesn't work that way. Grace doesn't give up on us, even when we've given up on ourselves. James found himself leaning forward, caught up in the simple honesty of Mark's words. There was no performance here, no attempt to impress or manipulate, just a man who'd been broken and somehow found a way to let light shine through the cracks. After the service, James waited while Mark greeted each member of his congregation personally. An elderly woman shared her concerns about her grandson's drinking. A middle-aged man talked about losing his job and struggling to find work. A young mother asked for prayers for her sick baby. Mark listened to each person with complete attention, offering comfort and practical help where he could. When the last parishioner had left, Mark finally approached James, his face breaking into a smile that was both joyful and nervous. "Jimmy Walsh, I wondered if you'd show up tonight." They embraced awkwardly, 8 years of separation, and shared guilt making the gesture both necessary and difficult. "Tommy told me you'd been asking about us," James said. "Every day for the past 5 years." Mark gestured toward his office, a small room behind the altar furnished with a simple desk, 2 chairs, and walls lined with books. "Can we talk?" Mark's seminary Bible sat open on his desk, its pages filled with handwritten notes and highlighted passages. The book looked well used, loved, like something that had been carried through difficult terrain and consulted frequently for direction. "I owe you both an apology," Mark began, settling into the chair behind his desk. "That night at the statue, what happened was my fault. I pushed for it. I led you there. I threw the first rock. If anyone deserved what happened, it was me. Mark, we all made the choice to be there. We all threw rocks. Maybe. But I was running from something that night, and I dragged you and Tommy along for the ride." Mark's hands traced the edge of his Bible, his fingers following patterns worn by years of handling. "My parents had another one of their fights that afternoon, worse than usual. My dad threw a bottle at the wall, and my mom locked herself in the bathroom crying. I couldn't stand being in that house another minute, so I went looking for trouble." James remembered the Torino household, the way conversations would stop suddenly when Mark walked into a room, the tension that seemed to follow him everywhere he went. "I wanted to break something that night because I felt so broken myself. And that statue seemed like a safe target, old, forgotten, probably nobody cared about it anyway." Mark's voice grew quieter. "I was wrong about that. So wrong. What happened to you after? After the bleeding stopped?" Mark was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on something beyond the small office window. "I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that statue's face. Sometimes she looked sad, sometimes disappointed, but never angry. That was the worst part. I wanted her to be angry because I deserved anger. Instead, she just looked at me like she was waiting for something. Waiting for what? I didn't know then. Took me years to figure it out." Mark pulled a photograph from his desk drawer and handed it to James. It showed a younger Mark in a hospital bed, pale and thin, connected to monitoring equipment. "This was taken about 6 years ago, right after my overdose. I was dead for almost 4 minutes before they got me back." James studied the photograph, trying to reconcile the broken young man in the hospital bed with the composed pastor sitting across from him. "I had what people call a near-death experience, though I don't like that term. Makes it sound trivial, like a dream or hallucination. What I experienced was more real than anything I've ever felt before or since." "What did you see?" "Her. The statue, but not as stone, as a real person. A woman in blue robes with the kindest eyes I've ever seen. She was crying, and when I asked her why, she said she was sad for all the lost children who thought they couldn't come home." Mark reached across the desk and retrieved the photograph, holding it carefully as if it was something precious. "She told me that some places hold prayers, that the statue wasn't just a piece of stone, but a collection of every prayer that had ever been offered there. All the hopes and fears and desperate pleas of people who had nowhere else to turn." And we'd thrown rocks at it like it was target practice. James felt a chill run through him. What did she want from you? To understand. To learn the story of that place and honor it properly. To help other people find their way home. Mark smiled, and for the first time since they'd started talking, he looked completely at peace. So that's what I've been doing. I got clean, went to seminary, started ministering to people who feel as lost as I used to feel. And every week, I go back to that statue and tell her about the people I've helped, the prayers I've answered, the healing I've witnessed. You really believe she's listening? I know she is, because every time I leave those flowers, I feel her forgiveness. And James, she's been waiting for you and Tommy too. She knows you're back in town. She's hoping you'll come home too. James drove away from the church that night. He found himself thinking about the idea of prayers being collected in places, accumulating like snow until they became something you could touch and feel. If that were true, then the statue wasn't just a memorial to someone's faith. It was a living repository of the community's hopes and fears, a place where the sacred and the everyday intersected. And if that were true, then what they'd done 8 years ago wasn't just vandalism. It was an attack on something holy, a violation of the trust between the human and the divine. But according to Mark, it was also forgivable. Maybe that was the real miracle. Not the punishment, but the possibility of redemption. The Millbrook Historical Society occupied a converted Victorian mansion on Main Street, its rooms filled with the carefully preserved artifacts of a town that had been farming and manufacturing community for over 2 centuries. James found himself there the next morning, driven by Mark's stories and his own growing need to understand what they'd stumbled into 8 years ago. Mrs. Eleanor Harrison, the Society's volunteer librarian, was a woman in her 70s with silver hair and the patient demeanor of someone who'd spent decades helping people trace their family histories and research old properties. She led James through rooms filled with display cases containing Civil War memorabilia, Native American artifacts, and faded photographs of long-dead residents. The old chapel, she mused, settling behind a desk covered with manila folders and index cards. Most people have forgotten it ever existed. But yes, there are records, quite detailed ones, actually. She pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age but still legible. The handwriting was careful and precise, the kind of penmanship they'd taught in schools when taking time with words was considered a virtue rather than an inconvenience. This is Sister Catherine Morrison's journal from the 1950s. She was the last nun to serve at Our Lady of Sorrows Chapel before it was deconsecrated in 1987. Mrs. Harrison turned the pages carefully, searching for a specific entry. Here we are. She writes quite extensively about the statue and its history. James leaned forward to read the faded ink. The Blessed Virgin watches over this place with special tenderness, as she has since Antonio Rossi completed her carving in the winter of 1923. Mr. Rossi worked with devotion that bordered on obsession, spending 14 months creating what he called a home for prayers that have nowhere else to go. Antonio Rossi? James asked. Italian immigrant, arrived here in 1922 with nothing but a set of carving tools and a commission from the Diocese of Hartford to create a statue for the new chapel. But according to Sister Catherine's notes, there was more to it than just a church commission. Mrs. Harrison turned several more pages, stopping at an entry dated October 15th, 1954. Listen to this. Mr. Rossi confided to Father McKenna that he had mixed soil from Lourdes, France, into the clay base of the statue before carving. Said his grandmother had given him a small vial of earth from the grotto where the Virgin appeared to Saint Bernadette, with instructions to use it only for something truly sacred. James felt something shift in his understanding. Lourdes, the site of miraculous healings, where thousands of pilgrims traveled each year seeking divine intervention for ailments that medical science couldn't cure. There's more, Mrs. Harrison continued, her finger tracing along Sister Catherine's. Oh, careful script. She documents several instances of what she calls unusual graces associated with the statue. A woman with cancer who experienced complete remission after praying there. A man struggling with alcoholism who never drank again after spending a night in vigil. Children with learning disabilities who suddenly began reading at grade level. Did she believe these were miracles? Sister Catherine was a practical woman. She'd trained as a nurse before taking her vows, so she understood the difference between medical phenomena and wishful thinking. But she also documented everything carefully, keeping detailed records of the people who came to pray and the outcomes of their visits. Mrs. Harrison stood and walked to a file cabinet, returning with a manila folder thick with papers. After the chapel closed, I've been collecting stories from people who still visit the statue. Unofficially, you understand, the Catholic Church doesn't encourage veneration of unsanctioned sites, but people keep coming, and remarkable things keep happening. She spread several handwritten letters across the desk. This one is from Maria Santos, not related to the historical Maria, just coincidence, who credits the statue with helping her find her missing grandfather when he wandered away from his nursing home with dementia. And this one is from a young man who was contemplating suicide until he spent an evening at the statue and felt what he described as overwhelming love and purpose. James picked up one of the letters, reading about a woman whose marriage had been saved after she and her husband prayed together at the statue during their worst crisis. The handwriting was shaky, emotional, but the story was told with simple conviction. What happened to Sister Catherine? Is she still alive? She is, actually. 92 years old and living at St. Francis Retirement Home about 20 minutes from here, sharp as ever, though her body is failing. She's been asking me to find someone to help preserve the statue's history properly. Mrs. Harrison's eyes twinkled with what might have been divine providence. I have a feeling she'd be very interested in talking with you. An hour later, James found himself in the cheerful common room of St. Francis Retirement Home, waiting for Sister Catherine Morrison to join him for tea. The elderly nun arrived in a wheelchair pushed by a young aide, but her eyes were bright and alert, and her handshake was surprisingly firm. "Mr. Walsh," she said, settling into a chair across from him, "Eleanor tells me you're researching our beloved statue. May I ask what sparked your interest?" James had prepared several different versions of this conversation, but looking into Sister Catherine's kind, perceptive eyes, he found himself telling the complete truth about that night 8 years ago. He told her about the rock throwing, Mark's sudden bleeding, the years of guilt and confusion that had followed. Sister Catherine listened without judgment, occasionally nodding as if she'd heard similar stories before. When James finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the wooden rosary beads that hung from her belt. "Forgiveness," she said finally, "is not the absence of consequences. It's the transformation of consequences into opportunities for growth. What happened to your friend wasn't punishment. It was an invitation to understand something greater than yourselves. But we damaged something sacred. We threw rocks at a statue that people had been praying to for decades. Yes, you did. And that statue absorbed your anger and pain along with everyone else's prayers. That's what sacred places do. They hold space for all of our human complexity, the beautiful and the broken alike." Sister Catherine reached into a small bag beside her chair and withdrew a bundle wrapped in soft cloth. "I've been waiting for the right person to entrust this to," she said, carefully unwrapping what appeared to be a set of old carving tools. "These belonged to Antonio Rossi. He left them at the chapel when his work was finished, along with a letter explaining his intentions. The tools were beautiful in their simplicity, chisels and rasps worn smooth by years of use, each one shaped by countless hours of patient work. James could almost feel the love and dedication that had gone into their use. Antonio wrote that he had embedded his own prayers into every stroke of the chisel, every curve of the statue's robes. He wanted to create something that would continue his work long after he was gone, a focal point for divine love that would never stop calling lost children home. James held one of the chisels, marveling at its perfect balance and the way it seemed to fit naturally in his hand, despite being created for someone else's grip. "Sister Catherine, why are you giving me these?" "Because I believe you and your friends have been called to be the statue's next guardians, not in any official capacity, you understand, but as young men who understand both the cost of disrespect and the power of redemption." She smiled, and James could see in her expression the same infinite patience he'd sensed in the statue's carved features. "The chapel may be gone, but the sacred place remains, and it needs people who understand its true purpose, not to judge or condemn, but to offer hope to anyone brave enough to approach with an honest heart." That evening, the three friends met at the statue as the sun began to set, each carrying the weight of what they'd learned about this place and about themselves. James brought Antonio Rossi's carving tools, wrapped carefully in Sister Catherine's soft cloth. Mark carried a bottle of blessed water from his church. Tommy brought a small shovel and work gloves, ready for whatever physical labor might be required. They approached the statue differently than they had 8 years ago, with reverence instead of recklessness, humility instead of bravado. The Virgin Mary stood as she always had, her arms outstretched in welcome, her stone face serene despite the chips and weathering that marked the passage of time. "I can see why Antonio spent 14 months on her," Tommy said, studying the intricate folds of the carved robes, the delicate features that somehow conveyed both strength and tenderness. "Look at the detail in her hands. Every line, every curve. It's like he was trying to capture something beyond just physical appearance." Mark knelt at the statue's base and began clearing away the accumulated debris of years. Fallen leaves, small branches, the detritus that collected around forgotten places. Sister Catherine was right about this being a place that holds prayers. I can feel them here, layered like sediment. Decades of people bringing their hopes and fears to this spot. As they worked to clean the area around the statue, James found himself studying the damage they'd caused 8 years earlier. The chip in the statue's outstretched hand was still visible, a small scar that would probably remain forever. But somehow, rather than marring the statue's beauty, it seemed to add to her humanity, proof that even sacred things could be wounded and still maintain their essential grace. "I called my ex-fiancée yesterday," James said, carefully using one of Antonio's smaller chisels to remove moss from the statue's base. "Sarah. We broke up 2 years ago when I became too focused on work to remember that relationships require actual participation." Mark looked up from his cleaning. "How did that go?" "Better than I expected. I apologized for being so absent during our last year together, for choosing career advancement over the person I claimed to love. She said she'd been waiting for me to figure out what really mattered." James paused in his work, remembering the conversation. "She's seeing someone else now, someone who shows up for her in ways I never did. But she forgave me, and that felt like a gift I didn't deserve." "Forgiveness usually is," Mark said quietly. Tommy had been working in silence, but now he straightened up and looked at his friends with an expression that was part relief and part worry. "I need to tell you guys something about my daughter, Sarah. She's been making some really poor choices lately, staying out past curfew, failing classes, hanging around with kids who think shoplifting is a fun weekend activity." He pulled off his work gloves and sat on a fallen log near the statue's base. "Last week, I found marijuana in her backpack. When I confronted her about it, she looked me straight in the eye and said, 'At least I'm not throwing rocks at religious statues.' She knows, somehow, about what we did here." James felt his stomach drop. How could she know? "We never told anyone. Kids have ways of finding out things you think you've kept secret. Maybe someone saw us that night. Maybe the story got passed around over the years. Hell, maybe she just put together the pieces. 3 guys who used to be best friends suddenly stop hanging out. Her dad, who gets uncomfortable every time we drive past this area. Mark moved to sit beside Tommy, his pastoral instincts kicking in. What did you say to her? Nothing. That's the problem. I froze up because how do you explain something like this to a 15-year-old? How do you tell your daughter that you once did something stupid and hurtful and that the guilt has been eating at you for 8 years? You tell her the truth, Mark said simply. You tell her that people make mistakes, that good people can do terrible things when they're young and scared and not thinking clearly. And you tell her that the most important thing isn't the mistake itself, but what you do afterward to make it right. As the three men continued their work, James found himself thinking about the letters Mrs. Harrison had shown him. All those people who'd found healing and hope at this place, despite its unofficial status. Despite the lack of church sanction or formal recognition, there was something powerful about faith that existed outside institutional boundaries, about sacred spaces that belonged to the community rather than to any specific organization. Mark, he said, what would happen if we told people about this place? Not the whole story necessarily, but just that it's here, that it's special, that people are welcome to come and pray. The church might not love that idea. They're careful about encouraging devotion to unsanctioned sites. Too much potential for superstition or false teaching. Mark paused in his cleaning, considering. But on the other hand, Sister Catherine spent 40 years documenting genuine spiritual experiences here, and people are already coming. They have been for decades. Maybe our role isn't to publicize the place, but to help take care of it properly. Tommy had been examining the statue's base more closely, and now he called the others over. Guys, look at this. There's something here. He was pointing to what appeared to be a loose stone near the foundation, partially hidden by decades of accumulated earth and plant growth. Working together, they carefully pried it free, revealing a small cavity beneath. Inside the hollow space, wrapped in oiled cloth, they found a bundle of papers and a small wooden box. James lifted out the papers. Now carefully, they appeared to be letters, written in the same careful hand they'd seen in Antonio Rossi's journal entries. These are addressed to future guardians, Mark said, reading over James's shoulder. Listen to this. If you are reading this, it means that the Blessed Virgin has called you to continue the work I began. The statue is more than stone and clay. It is a vessel for divine love, a sanctuary for hearts that have nowhere else to turn. Care for her as she will care for you. The wooden box contained what appeared to be a child's rosary beads, much older than the statue itself, along with a small vial of earth that might have been the remaining soil from Lourdes that Antonio had mixed into his original creation. But it was the final item that made all three men fall silent. A daguerreotype photograph of a young girl, perhaps 7 years old, with dark hair and solemn eyes. Solemn. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written Maria Santos, 1917-1924, forever in the care of Our Lady. This is why the statue is here, Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. This is what Antonio was really creating, not just a religious monument, but a memorial, a place where a mother's love could live forever. As darkness fell around them, the three friends sat in silence beside the statue, each lost in thought about the responsibility they'd unexpectedly inherited. They were no longer the reckless teenagers who'd thrown rocks at something they didn't understand. They were men who'd been entrusted with protecting something sacred, something that had been calling to them for 8 years, waiting patiently for them to grow wise enough to answer. The three friends decided to spend the entire night at the statue, something none of them had planned, but all of them felt compelled to do. They'd brought camping chairs and a thermos of coffee, settling in for what Mark called a vigil of understanding. Time. To absorb the full weight of what they'd discovered about this place and their connection to it. As the hours passed, their conversation meandered through childhood memories, adult regrets, and tentative hopes for the future. Tommy talked about his daughter's struggles and his own fears about being the kind of father who could guide her through the complexities of adolescence. Mark shared stories from his ministry, the broken people who found their way to his small church seeking something they couldn't name. James found himself opening up about the emptiness that had driven him to quit his corporate job, the sense that he'd been living someone else's definition of success. It was around 2 in the morning, when Tommy's flashlight caught something glinting in the earth near the statue's base. He'd been restless, walking small circles around the perimeter of the cleared area, when the beam picked up what looked like metal buried just beneath the surface. "There's something else here," he called to the others, dropping to his knees and brushing dirt away with his hands. Mark and James joined him, and together they carefully excavated what appeared to be a small metal box, green with age but still intact. Unlike the cavity they'd discovered earlier, this seemed to have been buried deliberately, placed with intention rather than hidden for safekeeping. The box was locked, but the mechanism was old and rusted. Tommy, ever practical, produced a small pry bar from his toolkit and managed to work it open without damaging the contents. Inside, wrapped in what had once been white silk but was now yellowed with age, they found a child's rosary beads. But these were different from the ones Antonio had left for them. These were made of simple wooden beads, worn smooth by countless prayers, with a small silver crucifix that had been polished bright by loving hands. Beneath the rosary was a folded piece of paper, fragile but still legible. Mark read it aloud by flashlight. "Sacred Heart of Jesus, please watch over my little Maria. She is only 7 years old and she is so sick. The doctors say there is nothing more they can do, but I know you can do miracles. Please don't take her. From me, I will do anything, give anything if you will let her stay. Your faithful servant, Carmen Santos." October 13th, 1924. The date hit them like a physical blow. According to the records they'd found, Maria Santos had died in the winter of 1924, just months after her mother had written this desperate prayer. But there was more in the box. Beneath Carmen's prayer, they found what appeared to be official documents, a land deed, signed and notarized, dated December 15th, 1924. The property being deeded was the exact plot of land where they now sat, transferred from Carmen Santos to the Diocese of Hartford for the purpose of building a chapel in memory of Maria Santos, beloved daughter, age 7, taken by influenza, but forever held in the arms of the Blessed Virgin. "She donated the land," James said, his voice barely audible. "After Maria died, Carmen gave this property to the church so they could build the chapel here." Mark was studying the deed more closely, running his finger along the faded text. "Look, at this clause here, it is the donor's specific wish that any religious statue or monument placed on this property be positioned directly above the burial site of Maria Santos, so that the child may rest forever in the protective embrace of Our Lady of Sorrows." The implications hit them simultaneously. The statue wasn't just placed randomly on chapel grounds. It was a gravestone, a monument marking the exact spot where a 7-year-old girl had been laid to rest. They'd been throwing rocks at a child's grave. Tommy stood up abruptly, walking several steps away from the statue before turning back, his face pale in the flashlight beam. "Jesus Christ, we desecrated a grave. We threw rocks at a little girl's memorial." "We didn't know," James said, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Does that matter? Does ignorance excuse what we did?" Tommy's voice was tight with a grief that went beyond their teenage mistake. "I've got a daughter the same age. Maria was when she died. If someone threw rocks at her grave—" "Tommy," Mark's voice was steady, pastoral. "Sit down, please." Reluctantly, Tommy returned to the group, but James could see the shame and horror written across his friend's face. "You're right," Mark continued. "Ignorance doesn't excuse what we did, but condemnation doesn't honor Maria's memory either. We can't change what happened 8 years ago, but we can choose what happens next." James was studying the photograph. of Maria Santos again, trying to reconcile the solemn-eyed child with the reality of what lay beneath the statue. "Mark, when you had your near-death experience, when you saw the Virgin Mary, did she say anything about Maria?" Mark was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on the statue's face. "She said something I didn't understand at the time. She said, 'Help me watch over the children who can't find their way home.' I thought she was talking metaphorically about spiritually lost people, but maybe she meant it literally," James finished. "Maybe she was asking you to help her. Watch over Maria." They sat in silence, absorbing the magnitude of what they'd uncovered. The statue wasn't just a religious monument or even a memorial. It was a mother's love made permanent, a desperate prayer answered in stone and sacred earth. Carmen Santos had given everything she had to ensure that her daughter would never be alone, never be forgotten, and 3 thoughtless teenagers had treated that sacrifice like target practice. "There's something else," Mark said quietly. He'd been reading through the other papers in the box, and now he held up what appeared to be a hand-drawn map. "This shows the original boundaries of the Santos property. It was much larger than just this lot. It included most of the land that's now downtown Millbrook." James studied the map, recognizing street names and landmarks. She owned half the town. Her family did, apparently. They were early settlers, probably accumulated land when it was cheap and plentiful. But according to this deed, Carmen gave it all to the church, not just this plot, but acres and acres of prime real estate. Why would she do that? Mark folded the papers carefully, treating them with the reverence they deserved. Because when you lose a child, money and property don't matter anymore. All that matters is making sure they're remembered, making sure they're protected, even in death. As dawn began to break over the statue, painting the stone figure in soft gold light, James felt a profound shift in his understanding of what they'd been called to do. This wasn't just about seeking forgiveness for a teenage mistake. It was about accepting responsibility for something much larger, the sacred trust that Carmen Santos had established a century ago, the promise that Maria would never be alone. "We need to tell people," he said suddenly. "Not about what we did. That's our burden to carry, but about what this place really is, about Maria and Carmen and the love that created this sanctuary." Tommy nodded slowly, his earlier horror transforming into determination. "A proper memorial, something that tells her story, honors her mother's sacrifice, and protects this place," Mark added. "Make sure it's never forgotten again. Never treated as anything less than the sacred ground it is." They were no longer 3 men seeking personal redemption. They were the inheritors of a century-old promise, guardians of a love that had transcended death itself. And for the first time since returning to Millbrook, James felt he understood exactly why he'd been called home. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of planning, research, and community outreach that none of them had anticipated when they'd first reunited at the statue. James found himself coordinating efforts from his parents' kitchen table, surrounded by legal documents, historical records, and contact information for everyone from the Town Planning Commission to the local historical society. His corporate experience, the same skills that had made him successful at optimizing consumer engagement, metrics proved surprisingly useful for organizing a grassroots memorial project. He created spreadsheets, developed timelines, and managed communication between multiple stakeholders, but this time every phone call and email was driven by purpose rather than profit. "The diocese is cautiously supportive," he reported to Mark and Tommy during one of their daily planning meetings. "Bishop Martinez says they can't officially endorse devotion to an unsanctioned site, but they're willing to participate in a historical commemoration that honors the Santos family's contribution to the community." Tommy looked up from the architectural sketches he'd been working on. "What about the town council? Any pushback about us doing this on private property?" "Actually, that's the interesting part. Turns out the land was never officially transferred back to private ownership after the chapel was deconsecrated. It's been in a kind of legal limbo for 30 years, technically still owned by the diocese, but not actively maintained or used. James pulled out a folder thick with legal documents. I've been working with a lawyer in Hartford who specializes in ecclesiastical property law. If we can demonstrate community interest and historical significance, there's a good chance we can get the land designated as a memorial park. Mark had been quietly reading through a stack of letters they'd received in response to their initial community outreach. Word had spread quickly through Millbrook's informal networks, coffee shop conversations, church bulletin boards, social media posts, and the response had been overwhelming. "Listen to this one," Mark said, holding up a handwritten note. "It's from Agnes Murphy. You remember Mrs. Murphy from the grocery store? She writes, 'I've been visiting that statue every year on the anniversary of my husband's death for the past 15 years. It's the only place I feel close to him anymore. Thank you for making sure it will be protected.'" James felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Every letter, every phone call, every conversation revealed another layer of the statue's importance to the community. People had been caring for this place quietly, privately, for decades, leaving flowers, saying prayers, finding comfort in Maria's perpetual guardianship. "Here's one from the Castellano family," Tommy said, looking slightly embarrassed. "My own relatives writing to tell me they've known about the statue for years and wondered why I never mentioned it. Apparently my grandmother used to bring my dad there when he was little, after they lost a baby to scarlet fever." The revelation that Tommy's own family had a connection to the statue was just one of many surprises that had emerged during their research. It seemed like half the families in Millbrook had some story connected to the little shrine, prayers answered, comfort found, hope restored in moments of desperation. Sister Catherine had become their unofficial advisor, consulting on everything, from the appropriate wording for Maria's memorial plaque to the selection of plants for the memorial garden Tommy was designing. Her enthusiasm for the project had reinvigorated her aging body, and she'd thrown herself into the work with an energy that amazed the nurses at St. Francis. "She insists on being present for the blessing ceremony," James told the others, "even though she'll have to come in her wheelchair, even though it means arranging special transportation. She says she's been waiting 40 years to see Maria properly honored." The blessing ceremony itself had grown from a simple gathering of the three friends to an interfaith community event that would include representatives from multiple denominations. Mark would offer the primary blessing, but they'd also invited Rabbi Sarah Goldman from Temple Beth Shalom and Pastor Williams from the African Methodist Episcopal Church to participate. "It feels right," Mark had explained when they'd discussed the interfaith approach. "Maria's grave has been holding prayers from people of all backgrounds for a century. The blessing should reflect that diversity." James had volunteered to fund the memorial elements, a bronze plaque telling Maria's story, a small memorial garden with native plants, and the restoration of the original chapel bell that Sister Catherine had discovered in the diocese storage facility. His corporate savings, originally intended for a down payment on a condo he'd never really wanted, would instead create something that might last for generations. Tommy had thrown himself into the physical aspects of the project with the same attention to detail he brought to his construction work. He'd designed a memorial garden that would require minimal maintenance while providing year-round beauty, native ferns and wildflowers that would thrive in the shade of the old oak tree, stone pathways that would allow easy access for elderly visitors, and a small bench positioned so that someone could sit quietly with Maria while still facing the statue. "The bench is oriented toward the sunrise," Tommy explained as they reviewed his final plans. "I thought about it, and Maria died in winter, December, according to the records. If someone comes here on the anniversary of her death, they'll be able to watch the sun come up and remember that even the darkest nights eventually end." As the day of the blessing ceremony approached, James found himself dealing with unexpected emotions. He'd thrown himself into the logistical work partly as a way of avoiding the deeper spiritual implications of what they were doing. But now, with everything almost ready, he couldn't escape the magnitude of the transformation he'd undergone. 2 weeks ago, he'd been a directionless former corporate executive with no clear sense of purpose. Now he was coordinating a community memorial project, working with clergy and historians and neighbors who'd become invested in honoring a child's memory. He'd found meaning in work again, but this time it was work that connected him to something larger than himself. The conversation with his ex-fiancée had led to other difficult but necessary phone calls. He'd reached out to former colleagues he'd alienated with his corporate ambition, apologizing for friendships he'd neglected in pursuit of professional advancement. He'd had long conversations with his parents about his future, admitting that he didn't know what came next, but felt confident that he was finally moving in the right direction. "I'm thinking about staying in Millbrook," he'd told his mother over dinner the previous evening. "Maybe starting a non-profit that helps communities preserve historical sites like this one. There's obviously a need for it, and I seem to have developed some useful skills." His mother had smiled with the particular satisfaction of a parent who'd been proven right about something important. "I always wondered when you'd remember that you wanted to help people. I'm glad you found your way back to that." Mark had been using the memorial project as an opportunity to expand his ministry's community outreach. His small congregation had embraced the interfaith blessing ceremony as a chance to build bridges with other faith communities, and he'd found himself in conversations with clergy from across the region about collaborative approaches to spiritual care. "It's interesting," he'd reflected during one of their planning sessions. "Working on Maria's memorial has reminded me that the sacred isn't confined to church buildings or official doctrine. Sometimes the most profound spiritual experiences happen in overlooked places among people who might never set foot in a formal religious service." The night before the blessing ceremony, the three friends met at the statue one final time to review their preparations and spend a quiet evening with Maria before her story became public knowledge. They'd installed the memorial plaque that afternoon, a simple bronze rectangle that read, "In memory of Maria Santos, 1917-1924, beloved daughter of Carmen Santos." This statue marks her resting place and honors her mother's faith that love transcends death. "May all who visit here find the peace that Maria has found in the arms of Our Lady." Below the inscription, they'd added Antonio Rossi's words from his letter to future guardians, "A sanctuary for hearts that have nowhere else to turn." As they sat in comfortable silence beside the statue, James found himself thinking about the mysterious nature of calling. How sometimes the most important work of your life emerged from the most unlikely circumstances. 8 years ago, their thoughtless act of vandalism had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the preservation and celebration of something sacred. He didn't believe that their teenage mistake had been divinely orchestrated. That seemed like a dangerous way of thinking about sin and consequence. But he was beginning to understand that redemption could transform even the worst mistakes into opportunities for grace, if you were willing to do the difficult work of making amends. Tomorrow, Maria Santos would finally receive the public recognition her mother had hoped for a century ago. Her story would be preserved, her resting place protected, and her mother's sacrificial love celebrated by a community that had learned to recognize the sacred in their midst. And 3 men who'd once been lost children themselves would take the first steps toward becoming the guardians they'd been called to be. The morning of the blessing ceremony dawned clear and cool, with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything seem more vivid and purposeful. James arrived at the statue site early, wanting to ensure that everything was ready before the community began to gather. Tommy's memorial garden had transformed the forgotten corner into something beautiful and, welcoming. The native plants he'd chosen were settling into their new environment, and the stone pathways he'd laid created natural gathering spaces around the statue. The bronze memorial plaque caught the morning sunlight, making Maria's story visible to anyone who approached. By 9 o'clock, people had begun to arrive. James was amazed by the diversity of the crowd. Elderly residents who remembered the original chapel, young families with children, teenagers who'd heard about the ceremony through social media, and visitors from neighboring towns who'd driven here specifically to participate in Maria's memorial. Mrs. Chen arrived with a beautiful arrangement of white flowers, the same type she'd been leaving at the statue for years. Agnes Murphy came with her adult children and grandchildren, 4 generations of a family that had found comfort at this shrine. Tommy's parents brought his daughter Sarah, who looked curious rather than rebellious for the first time in months. Sister Catherine arrived precisely at 9:30, transported in a specially equipped van and transferred carefully to her wheelchair. Despite her age and physical frailty, her eyes were bright with joy as she surveyed the transformed memorial site. 92 years old, she said to James as he knelt beside her wheelchair, "And this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Maria would be so pleased to know that her story is finally being told properly. The 3 clergy members, Mark, Rabbi Goldman, and Pastor Williams, had collaborated on a ceremony that honored both Maria's Catholic heritage and the interfaith nature of the community that had grown up around her memorial. They decided to begin with a reading of Maria's story, followed by prayers from each tradition and concluding with the blessing of the memorial garden. James found himself serving as the informal master of ceremonies, a role that felt both natural and terrifying. As the crowd settled into a respectful semicircle around the statue, he stepped forward to address the gathering. "Friends and neighbors," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air, "we're here today to honor the memory of a 7-year-old girl named Maria Santos, who died nearly a century ago, but whose presence has blessed this community ever since." He told Maria's story simply and directly, how she'd fallen ill during the influenza pandemic of 1924, how her mother Carmen had prayed desperately for her recovery, and how, after Maria's death, Carmen had donated her family's entire property holdings to ensure that her daughter would never be forgotten. "This statue," James continued, gesturing toward the weathered figure that had watched over the community for so many decades, "stands exactly where Maria was laid to rest. It was created by Antonio Rossi, an Italian immigrant who mixed sacred soil from Lourdes, France, into the statue's foundation. For 99 years, this has been a place where people have brought their prayers, their hopes, and their grief." As James spoke, he found himself looking out at faces that reflected the full spectrum of human emotion: tears, wonder, gratitude, and something that might have been recognition. These people had known somehow that this place was special. They'd felt Maria's presence even without knowing her story. "But this memorial isn't just about remembering the past," James continued. "It's about recognizing the sacred in our midst, about understanding that some places hold more than we can see. Maria's mother believed that love could transcend death, and this statue stands as proof that she was right." When James finished speaking, Mark stepped forward to offer the first blessing. Instead of his clerical collar, he wore simple civilian clothes, wanting to speak not just as a pastor, but as someone who'd found healing at this place. "Maria Santos," Mark said, his voice warm with affection, "we come before you today not as strangers, but as neighbors who've benefited from your silent guardianship. We ask your forgiveness for the times this place wasn't treated with the respect it deserved, and we promise to honor your memory by caring for all who seek comfort here." Rabbi Goldman followed with a Hebrew prayer for the dead, her voice rising and falling with ancient rhythms that seemed to harmonize perfectly with the rustling of leaves in the oak tree above. Pastor Williams offered a blessing in the African-American tradition, his rich baritone voice calling down protection and peace on all who would visit Maria's resting place. As the formal blessings concluded, something unexpected happened. People began to step forward spontaneously, placing flowers at the statue's base and sharing brief, personal testimonies about what this place had meant to them. An elderly man spoke about finding the strength to quit drinking after spending a night here 20 years ago. A middle-aged woman shared how she'd brought her infant son here when doctors said he wouldn't survive and how he'd recovered completely. A teenager talked about coming here when her parents were divorcing and finding the peace she needed to help her family heal. James felt his chest tighten with emotion as the testimonies continued. Each story added another layer to his understanding of what Maria's presence had accomplished in this community. She hadn't just been a passive memorial, she'd been an active source of comfort and healing for decades. Sister Catherine had been listening to the testimonies with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. When the last person had spoken, she raised her hand slightly, and the crowd fell silent. "I have something to add," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow audible to everyone present. "I've been Maria's caretaker for 40 years, and I want you all to know that she's been listening. Every prayer, every tear, every moment of hope you've brought to this place, she's held them all." The ceremony concluded with the ringing of the restored chapel bell, the same bell that had called people to worship when Maria was alive. Sister Catherine had insisted on being the one to ring it, and despite her frailty, she managed to pull the rope 3 times, sending clear, sweet tones across the memorial garden and out into the surrounding community. As the sound of the bell faded, James felt a profound sense of completion. They'd done what they'd set out to do. Maria's story had been told, her memory honored, and her resting place transformed into a proper memorial. But more than that, they'd created something that would continue Maria's work of offering comfort to anyone brave enough to approach with an honest heart. As the formal ceremony concluded and people began to mingle around the memorial garden, James noticed something extraordinary happening. The gathering wasn't dispersing the way he'd expected. Instead, small groups were forming naturally. Strangers, introducing themselves to each other, sharing stories and connections that went beyond their shared experience at Maria's memorial. Tommy's daughter, Sarah, had approached Sister Catherine's wheelchair and was listening intently as the elderly nun showed her Antonia Rossi's original carving tools. The teenager who'd spoken about her parents' divorce was talking with Agnes Murphy about the challenges of keeping families together during difficult times. Rabbi Goldman and Pastor Williams were deep in conversation about interfaith cooperation in addressing community needs. "Look at this," Mark said quietly, joining James near the memorial plaque. "This is what Maria's been doing all along, bringing people together, creating connections between neighbors who might never have spoken otherwise." James nodded, watching as his own parents introduced themselves to Tommy's family, and Mrs. Chen shared stories with some of the younger visitors about the neighborhood's history. The memorial service had become something larger than they'd planned, a genuine community gathering that transcended denominational and generational boundaries. But it was what happened next that would stay with James for the rest of his life. A woman he didn't recognize approached the statue, carrying a small bouquet of white roses. She was perhaps 40 years old, well-dressed, with the kind of quiet dignity that suggested someone accustomed to carrying heavy burdens with grace. She knelt at the statue's base and placed her flowers carefully among the dozens of other tributes that had accumulated during the ceremony. As she stood, James noticed that she was crying, not the gentle tears of sentiment, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone confronting profound grief. Several people nearby noticed her distress and moved closer, offering comfort without words, simply standing in supportive silence around her. "My son," she said when she could finally speak, her voice barely audible. "My son, David. He was diagnosed with leukemia 6 months ago, 8 years old. The doctors say there's nothing more they can do." Sister Catherine wheeled her chair closer, reaching out to take the woman's hand. "What's your name, dear?" Linda Morrison. We live about an hour from here, but I heard about today's ceremony on the radio. I hoped. She broke down again, unable to finish the sentence. You hoped Maria might intercede for David, Sister Catherine said gently. You came here looking for a miracle. Linda nodded, wiping her eyes with a tissue someone had handed her. I know it sounds foolish. I'm not even particularly religious. But when you're losing a child, you'll try anything, believe in anything that might help. Mark stepped forward, his pastoral training guiding him towards someone in spiritual crisis. Linda, it doesn't sound foolish at all. Parents have been bringing their sick children to this place for a century, seeking exactly what you're seeking. Has it ever worked? Linda asked, her voice desperate with hope and fear. Have there ever been actual healings? Sister Catherine and Mark exchanged glances. They documented numerous accounts of unexpected recoveries, inexplicable improvements, and medical outcomes that defied easy explanation. But they'd also learned to be careful about promising miracles to grieving parents. There have been healing that medical science couldn't explain, Sister Catherine said carefully. But more importantly, there have been countless instances of people finding the strength to face whatever comes next, the peace to accept outcomes they can't control, and the grace to discover meaning even in suffering. Linda was listening intently, her eyes fixed on the statue's serene face. I just want him to know he's loved. I want him to feel safe, even if I can't save him. Then you've come to the right place, Tommy said, surprising everyone by joining the conversation, because that's exactly what Maria does. She holds love for children who need to feel safe. As if responding to some invisible signal, the entire gathering began to move closer to Linda, forming a circle around her and the statue. Without anyone organizing it, without any formal invitation, people began to pray, some silently, some aloud, some in languages James didn't recognize, but all with the same intention of surrounding this grieving mother with support. James found himself praying for the first time in years, not asking for a specific outcome, but simply offering whatever strength he had to someone who needed it more than he did. Around him, he could hear Mark's voice leading a formal blessing, Rabbi Goldman chanting in Hebrew, Pastor Williams calling on divine mercy, and dozens of individual voices adding their own petitions to the collective prayer. It was in that moment, as the community united in prayer around Linda and her absent son, that James noticed something that made him catch his breath. At the base of the statue, growing up through a crack in the stone foundation, was a single white rose, fresh, perfect, and completely inexplicable. No one had planted it. No one had placed it there. It was simply growing, as if the earth itself was offering a sign of hope. Sister Catherine saw it at the same moment James did, and their eyes met in shared wonder. Some things, she whispered, are beyond our understanding, but not beyond our acceptance. The white rose stood as a silent testimony to the mystery they were all part of, a reminder that in a world full of suffering and uncertainty, grace still found ways to surprise them. Love still transcended the boundaries between earth and heaven, and hope still grew in the most unlikely places. 6 months after the blessing ceremony, James Walsh stood in the office of the Santos Memorial Foundation, a non-profit organization he'd established to preserve historical sites with spiritual significance. The office occupied a small space above Murphy's Diner, close enough to Maria's memorial that he could walk there during his lunch breaks, far enough from his parents' house that he felt like a proper adult again. The foundation had grown beyond anything he'd imagined when he'd first conceived it. Word of Maria's story had spread through social media and regional news coverage, attracting attention from historians, theologians, and community organizers across New England. 3 other towns had contacted him about similar forgotten memorials in their areas, and he was developing a model for community-driven historical preservation that emphasized spiritual as well as cultural significance. But the real measure of success wasn't in the foundation's expanding mission. It was in what had happened to the memorial itself and to the community that had embraced it. The statue site had become a regular pilgrimage, destination for people seeking comfort, healing, or simply a quiet place to reflect. The guest book that Sister Catherine had suggested, a simple leather-bound journal kept in a weatherproof box near the memorial plaque, was filled with entries from visitors who'd traveled from as far away as Canada and Florida to spend time with Maria. Some entries were brief. "Thank you for the peace I found here." Others were longer testimonies about prayers answered, relationships healed, and hope restored. A few were simply lists of names: children, parents, spouses, friends, people who were being held in prayer by visitors who believed Maria's intercession could make a difference. Linda Morrison had become a regular visitor, driving down from Massachusetts every weekend to spend time at the memorial. Her son, David's leukemia, had gone into unexpected remission 2 weeks after the blessing ceremony, a development his oncologist described as highly unusual, but medically documented. Linda was careful not to claim divine intervention, but she'd started a support group for parents of critically ill children that met monthly at the memorial site. "I don't know if Maria healed my son," Linda had told James during one of her visits, "but I know she healed me. She gave me the strength to be the mother David needed, whether he lived or died. That's its own kind of miracle." Mark's ministry had expanded significantly since the blessing ceremony. His small church was now part of an interfaith coalition that provided social services throughout the region, and he'd been invited to speak at seminaries about community-based spiritual care. But he still returned to the statue every week, leaving fresh flowers and spending time in quiet prayer with the friend who'd started him on his journey toward redemption. Tommy's construction company had specialized increasingly in historical restoration work, often donating services to preserve religious sites and community landmarks. His daughter Sarah had volunteered to help maintain the memorial garden, and her relationship with her father had improved dramatically as they worked together on projects that had clear purpose and meaning. "It's funny," Tommy had reflected recently, "I spent years worrying about Sarah making good choices, but it turned out the best thing I could do was show her what good choices looked like." The white rose that had appeared during the blessing ceremony had continued to bloom inexplicably, producing flowers even during the harsh New England winter. Botanists had no explanation for its survival in conditions that should have killed it, but visitors took it as a sign that Maria's presence remained active and loving. Sister Catherine had lived to see the memorial's first anniversary celebration, passing away peacefully in her sleep just 2 weeks later. Her funeral had been held at the memorial site rather than in a church, reflecting her final wish to be remembered where she'd felt closest to the divine mystery she'd spent her life serving. James found himself thinking about Sister Catherine often as he went about his daily work with the foundation. She'd taught him that some forms of faith couldn't be contained within institutional boundaries, that the sacred had a way of breaking out into the ordinary world and making itself known to anyone willing to pay attention. His relationship with his ex-fiancée Sarah had evolved into a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared understanding. She'd visited the memorial several times and had become one of the foundation's major donors, recognizing the transformative work that James had found in honoring forgotten stories. "You're different," she told him during her most recent visit. "More grounded, more purposeful, like you finally figured out who you're supposed to be." James supposed that was true. He'd spent his 20s trying to become someone impressive, accumulating credentials and achievements that looked good on paper but felt hollow in practice. Now, at 29, he was doing work that mattered to him, surrounded by people who shared his commitment to preserving the sacred in everyday life. The memorial had taught him that redemption wasn't a destination, but a continuous process. The daily choice to transform past mistakes into present service, to let guilt become guidance, to allow broken places in your life to become sources of strength for others. Every evening, as he locked up the foundation office and walked past the memorial on his way home, James would pause to read a few entries in the guest book and ensure that fresh flowers were in place. It had become his own form of prayer, this quiet maintenance of a sacred space that had grown from three teenagers' worst mistake into a community's greatest blessing. Maria Santos had been dead for nearly a century, but her presence remained as real and comforting as ever. She continued to do what her mother had prayed for, watching over children who needed to feel safe, offering hope to parents who had nowhere else to turn, and reminding everyone who found their way to her memorial that love, once given freely, never really dies. In the gathering dusk, with the lights of Millbrook beginning to twinkle in windows across the town, James would touch the memorial plaque gently and whisper the words that had become his evening prayer. "Thank you, Maria. Thank you for calling us home.